Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back into the dusty arenas of ancient Rome, into a world of roaring crowds, sweaty sand, dented helmets, and men whose career plans usually ended somewhere between brief celebrity and violent cautionary tale. So settle in, dim the lights a little, maybe imagine the distant sound of sandals scraping across stone corridors while somebody nearby makes watered wine in a clay cup and quietly regrets several life choices. Tonight we're following the gladiators who survived, which for ancient Rome already made them statistical overachievers. Because when people picture gladiators, they usually imagine dramatic deaths in giant arenas beneath thunderous applause. Hollywood loves that version. Massive battles, muscular speeches, slow-motion sand flying majestically through the air. The Romans themselves preferred something slightly more practical. Most gladiators were expensive investments, and Romans, for all their talent for organized violence, did understand basic economics occasionally. A well-trained fighter cost money to feed, train, house, and medically maintain. Killing one every afternoon would have been financially irritating, which meant many gladiators survived multiple fights. Some even became celebrities, though admittedly celebrities with a life expectancy hovering nervously beside disaster. And eventually, if fortune allowed, every gladiator faced the same strange question. What exactly happens after the arena? What happens when the crowd stops cheering? When your knees fail? When your shoulder never quite heals correct? When younger fighters arrive with better reflexes and fewer old stab wounds? Well, Rome had several answers, most of them uncomfortable. Let's begin in the gladiator schools themselves. The ludus, which sounds faintly cheerful until you remember it was essentially a heavily guarded training prison full of armed men with unresolved trauma. A gladiator's daily life revolved around routine, endless exercise, weapon drills, controlled diets, medical treatments, supervised sleep, and contrary to popular belief, many gladiators were not starved slaves barely clinging to life. In fact, they were often fed surprisingly well. Heavy carbohydrate diet, barley porridge, beans, dried fruit, bread, lots of calories. Roman writers occasionally mocked gladiators as barley men, which feels almost disappointingly tame as an insult. Not exactly terrifying. Imagine entering the arena while thousands chant, "Look at the barley man." Still, the diet had purpose. Gladiators carried layers of fat over muscle because slight padding actually helped protect against superficial wounds. Roman spectators enjoyed visible bleeding tremendously, a deeply concerning civilization in many respects. But training mattered more than raw savagery. Gladiators practiced constantly under instructors, many of whom were retired fighters themselves. And here we meet one possible future for aging gladiator. The doctor, not the medical kind. The Latin word doctor simply meant teacher or trainer. A retired gladiator who survived long enough, fought skillfully enough, and maintained the favor of the lanista, the owner of the gladiator school, might become an instructor, which sounds respectable, until you remember the workplace remained full of exhausted men practicing murder techniques under strict supervision while half-healed injuries quietly leaked through bandages nearby. Still, compared to dying in the arena, it was considered an excellent retirement plan. These older trainers became enormously important inside the schools. They taught fighting styles, discipline, survival strategies, and perhaps most importantly, they taught younger fighters how not to panic. Because the arena itself was psychologically horrifying. The noise alone must have been overwhelming. Tens of thousands screaming beneath blazing Mediterranean heat while musicians played and vendors sold snacks nearby. Nothing says relaxing afternoon like olives and public combat. Veteran gladiators understood something young fighters didn't yet grasp. The crowd could smell fear. Roman audiences adored composure. A gladiator who fought skillfully, accepted wounds calmly, and displayed discipline under pressure could become wildly admired, even if he lost, especially if he lost elegantly. Romans respected controlled suffering almost as much as they respected conquest. Stoicism mattered deeply in Roman culture, which meant older gladiators sometimes became philosophical role models in the strangest possible way. Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, wrote about arena fighters occasionally with a weird mixture of horror and admiration, because Roman intellectuals often condemned gladiatorial games publicly while still attending them anyway. A very ancient version of "I can explain," and older gladiators embodied something Romans found emotionally satisfying: endurance. Scarred men surviving impossible circumstances through discipline alone. Naturally, Rome immediately turned that into entertainment. Some retired gladiators remained attached to the arena in ceremonial roles. A few became referees. Yes, gladiator referees existed. Roman combat had rules, which somehow makes everything both more civilized and more absurd simultaneously. Referees carried staffs and supervised fights carefully. They could pause combat, separate exhausted fighters, enforce regulations. Imagine officiating a sword duel professionally. Alright gentlemen, excellent stabbing form overall, but let's keep shield work tidy. Many referees were likely former gladiators whose experience earned respect, and unlike active fighters, they could grow old visibly. Quite a novelty in gladiatorial culture. Age itself carried strange meanings in Rome. Roman society admired youthful strength intensely, but it also respected visible survival. Scars became proof of endurance. Old fighters carried reputations younger men couldn't imitate. A retired gladiator walking through town might still attract attention years later, especially successful ones. And yes, some gladiators became astonishingly famous. Their popularity occasionally bordered on embarrassing. Graffiti survives from Roman cities praising particular fighters the way modern fans praise athletes or musicians. Women reportedly adored certain gladiators. Wealthy citizens collected memorabilia. Children probably pretended to fight like them in alleyways, while exhausted parents wondered where civilization went wrong. One gladiator named Celadus was described in graffiti as the heartthrob of the girls, which sounds less like a terrifying warrior and more like someone performing acoustic music at Roman coffeehouses. But fame created opportunities. Successful retired gladiators could become bodyguards, trainers for wealthy nobles, or personal security figures attached to elite households. Roman aristocrats loved surrounding themselves with intimidating men, preferably intimidating men loyal through debt, fear, or financial dependence. A retired gladiator fit beautifully into this ecosystem, especially because politicians in Rome constantly feared assassination. Honestly, with reasonable justification, Roman politics had the emotional stability of a collapsing staircase. Conspiracies flourished everywhere. Alliances shifted overnight. Senators smiled politely while arranging murder. And so wealthy men hired experienced fighters for protection. Some former gladiators even entered politics indirectly through patronage networks. They attached themselves to powerful households, becoming symbols of prestige and controlled violence. A subtle reminder that your host technically employed men trained to stab people professionally. Very elegant dinner party atmosphere. Others drifted into less glamorous lives. Not every gladiator retired with fame or money. Many left the arena permanently damaged. Ancient medical care could treat wounds surprisingly well sometimes. Roman physicians understood bones, stitches, and basic surgical techniques better than many people assume. But chronic pain remained everywhere. Joint damage, nerve injuries, infections, poorly healed fractures, repeated concussions. And because gladiators often began fighting young, their bodies aged rapidly. A man in his 30s might already move like an exhausted laborer decades older, especially after years of armor, blunt force trauma, and sword injuries. Some simply disappeared into ordinary urban life, which in Rome meant crowded apartment blocks, noisy streets, smoky taverns, and a permanent background scent of sewage. The empire's greatest city was magnificent from a distance. Closer up, considerably more damp. Retired gladiators likely worked wherever they could. Dock labor, market security, tavern management, transport work, physical jobs, dangerous jobs. Rome always needed strong men willing to accept risk, and gladiators were extremely familiar with risk by that point. A few purchased freedom formally using prize money accumulated over years. Victorious fighters earned rewards, coins, gifts, occasionally substantial wealth if they became famous enough. The ultimate symbolic reward was the rudis, a wooden sword granted to gladiators who earned release from combat. The rudis represented freedom, or at least Rome's complicated approximation of freedom. Ceremonies awarding the rudis could become emotional public spectacles. Crowds cheered, officials praised bravery. Retired fighters stood beneath sunlight holding wooden swords instead of steel ones, a strangely gentle object for such brutal lives. Though retirement did not always mean complete escape, some gladiators returned voluntarily for special appearances, because of course they did. Fame is difficult to abandon, especially when ordinary life afterward involves carrying grain sacks beside the Tiber River while nobody applauds. Roman crowds loved comeback stories. A retired champion returning briefly to the arena could attract enormous attention. Aging fighters became legendary figures. Their scars carried narrative weight. Every old wound suggested survival, and Romans adored survival stories almost as much as they adored public execution, which is admittedly an unsettling combination. One fascinating detail about retired gladiators involves medicine. Gladiator schools employed physicians constantly because injured fighters represented financial losses. Some medical practitioners gained extraordinary experience treating trauma inside these schools. Galen, one of the ancient world's most famous physicians, worked with gladiators early in his career, meaning that while Roman senators complained theatrically about arena violence, Rome's medical science quietly benefited from examining endless combat injuries. Civilization is often extremely strange. Gladiators themselves developed practical medical knowledge too. Older fighters understood wounds intimately, which cuts healed cleanly, which infections killed slowly, which herbs numbed pain slightly. A veteran gladiator probably knew more about surviving physical trauma than many aristocrats who considered themselves civilized. And that contrast appears constantly in Roman culture. Elite Romans often looked down socially on gladiators while secretly admiring them intensely, because gladiators embodied qualities Roman men valued theoretically: courage, discipline, endurance, masculinity. But they also occupied low social status, which created deep cultural confusion. Roman noblewomen reportedly became infatuated with gladiators often enough that writers complained about it bitterly. Juvenal mocked elite women obsessed with arena fighters, describing them abandoning respectable husbands for scarred combatants. Probably exaggerated, though Roman satirists exaggerated everything. Still, the anxiety itself reveals something important. Gladiators possessed raw physical charisma in a society obsessed with status performance. A senator might have wealth, education, and political power, but the gladiator had visible danger, and humans, unfortunately, remain fairly predictable about this across centuries. Some retired gladiators married eventually, started families, opened businesses. A few inscriptions suggest former fighters achieved modest stability later in life. Not luxurious stability, more small tavern with recurring back pain stability, but stability nonetheless. And there's something oddly touching about those fragments. A man surviving years of arena combat only to spend old age arguing over wine prices and repairing furniture. A quieter ending than Rome usually offered. Of course, many gladiators never reached old age at all. Even survival carried constant uncertainty. Disease swept through crowded cities regularly. Economic hardship lingered. Political instability erupted constantly. The Roman Empire excelled at infrastructure and conquest. Long-term emotional wellness less so. And yet people adapted. They always do. Retired gladiators formed friendships, networks, shared identities. Some gravestones proudly recorded arena achievements decades later. Fighters remained gladiators psychologically even after retirement. The arena marked them permanently, perhaps because once thousands of people have watched you nearly die under blazing sunlight, ordinary experiences feel slightly different afterward. Even silence changes. Imagine sitting quietly in old age after decades of noise. No cheering crowds, no armor straps tightening, no referees raising staffs, just distant street sounds drifting through Roman evening air while your damaged hands rest beside a cup of watered wine. And somewhere nearby, younger fighters continue training in dusty courtyard. New bodies entering the machine. Rome always required more spectacle, which means next time we'll drift further into the peculiar emotional world of gladiators themselves. The superstitions, the rivalries,
the strange friendships between men expected to kill each other professionally, and the wonderfully uncomfortable fact that Roman crowds sometimes became emotionally invested in very specific arena personalities, while simultaneously requesting executions during lunch breaks. Because ancient Rome, as always, contained multitudes.
Welcome back, everyone. Tonight we'll drift once more beneath the heavy awnings of ancient Rome, back into the arenas, back into the hot stone corridors beneath the Colosseum, where oil lamps flickered against walls stained by smoke, sweat, and generations of exhausted ambition. So settle in again. Maybe pull the blanket a little closer, and together we'll continue wandering through the surprisingly complicated afterlives of gladiators. Men who survived public violence long enough to discover that retirement, unfortunately, still involved being Roman, which remained tiring in entirely new ways. Last time we spoke about aging fighters becoming trainers, referees, bodyguards, and occasionally local celebrities with severe knee problems. Tonight, we move deeper into the quieter, emotional world surrounding the arena itself, because gladiators were not simply killing machines. Though Rome certainly advertised them that way, they were human beings trapped inside a system that rewarded brutality, theatricality, and survival in very uneven proportions. And over time, many developed strange routines and beliefs designed to make daily life psychologically manageable. Superstitions flourished constantly in gladiator culture. Naturally, if your profession involved entering an arena while armed strangers attempted to stab you before 40,000 screaming spectators, you probably became slightly open to lucky charms. Many gladiators carried amulets, tiny carved figures, protective symbols, bones, coins, small religious objects tucked beneath armor straps. Some prayed obsessively before combat. Others avoided particular foods. Certain fighters reportedly refused to enter the arena with the left foot first because someone once died after doing exactly that. A compelling scientific sample size of one. Roman religion itself encouraged this atmosphere. Omens mattered everywhere in Roman life. Birds flying incorrectly could delay military campaigns. Unusual weather frightened politicians. Priests examined animal organs searching for divine approval, which must have made dinner parties awkward occasionally. Oh dear, the liver appears troubling. Gladiators absorbed these habits naturally. The arena felt governed partly by skill and partly by invisible forces no one entirely understood. And honestly, from their perspective, that was not irrational. Two equally trained men might fight. One survives because his sandal grips correctly in loose sand. Another slips slightly and dies in front of an audience eating figs. Chance hovered over everything. Older gladiators became especially superstitious sometimes. Veteran fighters developed intricate pre-battle rituals over years of survival. Specific stretches, specific prayers, specific ways of wrapping bandages, specific conversations avoided entirely before combat. Many refused intimacy before major fights. Others insisted upon it. Human beings remain beautifully inconsistent. One retired gladiator described by later Roman writers supposedly slept beside his helmet every night, even years after leaving the arena, which sounds tragic and also understandable. Violence reshapes routine deeply. Soldiers throughout history describe similar habits. Fighters become accustomed to danger so thoroughly thoroughly that ordinary peace feels unnatural afterward. And gladiators rarely experience true peace anyway. Even retirement could be unstable. Some former fighters return to gladiator schools simply because they no longer fit comfortably elsewhere. Civilian life demanded different instincts, different rhythms. Imagine spending 15 years training for survival every day, only to suddenly manage olive inventories in a market stall. The body survives one world, the mind remains elsewhere, and the schools themselves created powerful emotional bonds. Oddly powerful considering the circumstances, because gladiators trained together constantly, ate together, suffered together. Many arrived as slaves, prisoners of war, criminals, or debtors. Men stripped from previous identities entirely. Inside the ludus, new identities formed. Fighting styles became personalities almost theatrical in nature. The Murmillo carried a large shield and heavy helmet. The Retiarius fought with net and trident, lightly armored and fast. The Secutor pursued him with smooth helmet and short sword. Each style carried stereotypes, rivalries, expectations. Roman audiences developed favorites exactly like sports fans, and the gladiators themselves performed these identities carefully because popularity mattered financially. Some fighters became known for dramatic entrances, others for mercy, others for terrifying aggression. One suspects the aggressive ones received less dinner party conversation afterward. Older gladiators often mentored younger recruits unofficially, not merely teaching combat, but teaching emotional survival, how to conserve energy during long waits underground, how to interpret crowd moods, how to avoid panic when injured publicly, because panic could kill faster than wounds sometimes. The arena rewarded calmness almost cruelly. Roman spectators admired composure under suffering to an extent modern people might find slightly alarming. A wounded gladiator expected sympathy only if he remained dignified. Screaming excessively was considered embarrassing, which feels unfair under the circumstances. Imagine being stabbed while thousands judge your emotional professionalism. And yet, older fighters mastered these expectations. Some even manipulated them brilliantly. A veteran gladiator understood pacing, understood spectacle. He knew when to appear exhausted, when to rally dramatically, when to acknowledge the crowd. Arena combat was theater as much as violence, perhaps more. Contrary to popular imagination, gladiator fights did not always end in death. Many matches concluded when one fighter surrendered formally. The defeated gladiator might raise a finger requesting mercy. Then came the terrible pause. The crowd reacted, officials deliberated, and somewhere beneath layers of armor and sweat, two exhausted men waited while thousands decided whether continued existence seemed entertaining. An emotionally difficult workplace environment overall. Older gladiators who survived repeatedly learned audience psychology almost professionally. Crowds appreciated bravery, skill, style. A fighter who entertained effectively might receive mercy more often because spectators wanted future performances, which meant successful gladiators became performers of mortality rather than simple victims of it. Rome transformed survival into narrative, and audiences became emotionally attached in surprising ways. Graffiti survives praising specific fighters by name. Some fans tracked win records obsessively. Ancient sports culture, essentially, except participants occasionally died with tridents involved. Women attended games regularly too, despite later assumptions otherwise. Some aristocratic women apparently admired gladiators intensely. Roman moralists complained about this endlessly. Whenever ancient writers begin complaining repeatedly about something, it usually means people were absolutely doing it. One writer described elite women lusting after scarred fighters despite their low status. again probably exaggerated, though perhaps not entirely. Gladiators represented physical danger in a society obsessed with hierarchy and restraint. Their bodies carried visible evidence of violence. Scars fascinated Romans. A smooth body suggested luxury. A scarred one suggested endurance. Old gladiators accumulated scars almost artistically over time. Sword cuts, burns, bone fractures healed crookedly beneath skin. Some carried missing fingers or damaged ears. And yet these injuries could become status symbols inside arena culture. Proof of experience, proof of survival. A young recruit entering the training yard might see older fighters stretching stiffly in morning light, bodies marked by years of combat. Living instruction manuals, and perhaps cautionary tales too, because aging in gladiator culture was awkward. The arena celebrated youthful strength relentlessly. Speed mattered, reflexes mattered. An older gladiator might still possess skill, but eventually the body slowed. Tiny delays became dangerous. A missed block, a slower recovery step, an old shoulder injury suddenly refusing cooperation. And everyone noticed. Crowds could be merciless toward decline. Roman spectators adored triumph but grew impatient with weakness quickly. An aging champion losing repeatedly became uncomfortable public theater, like watching mortality itself enter the arena carrying a shield. Some older fighters adapted strategically. They fought more defensively, relied on technique over athleticism. Others retired abruptly after single catastrophic losses, and some refused retirement entirely, which almost never ended well historically. One can imagine the conversations inside gladiator school. You should stop. I still have another year. You limp when it rains. The crowd still remembers me. A deeply human exchange, because identity becomes difficult to surrender once it defines survival. Many gladiators owned almost nothing beyond reputation. Without the arena, who exactly were they? Rome offered few comforting answers. Some retired fighters drifted toward religion eventually. Not surprising, really. Near-death experiences tend to encourage spiritual reflection. The cult of Nemesis became particularly associated with gladiators. Nemesis represented fate, vengeance, balance, a fitting goddess for people whose careers depended partly on chance and public judgment. Shrines dedicated by gladiators survive archaeologically. Small inscriptions thanking gods for survival, or requesting future survival politely. One senses the gods received many such requests. Mithraism also attracted soldiers and fighters across the empire. Secretive rituals, brotherhood, shared endurance. The details remain mysterious because initiates protected their ceremonies carefully, which only made Romans more interested naturally. Human beings become instantly fascinated by any gathering described as strictly private. Retired gladiators may have found comfort in these religious communities. Structure, belonging, identity beyond entertainment. Because the arena consumed identity aggressively, Roman crowds reduced people into roles quickly. Hero, coward, champion, loser, exotic foreigner, savage barbarian, crowd favorite, disposable criminal. The complexity of actual human lives disappeared beneath spectacle, and yet traces survive occasionally in inscriptions. A gladiator buried by friends, a wife dedicating a gravestone, a fellow fighter describing someone as loyal or brave. Tiny fragments of tenderness surviving inside an extraordinarily brutal system. One gravestone commemorates a gladiator named Diodorus, whose friends blamed a referee for his death, which feels surprisingly modern. Even in ancient Rome, sports fans apparently argued about officiating. Some retired gladiators attempted business ventures. Taverns proved common because taverns welcomed rough reputations naturally. A former arena fighter running a drinking establishment possessed obvious advantages during customer disputes, though disadvantages too. One suspects some patrons became unbearably eager to discuss combat after several cups of wine. Go on then, show us the shoulder wound again. Humanity has not evolved as much as we flatter ourselves. Others worked as trainers for wealthy households. Roman aristocrats occasionally hired combat instructors for sons needing masculine discipline. Nothing says refined education like a retired gladiator teaching knife defense beside decorative garden fountain. Roman elite culture combined sophistication and violence constantly. Poetry readings upstairs, stabbing lessons downstairs, and beneath everything lurked the empire's enormous dependence on slavery. Most gladiators lacked meaningful choice for much of their lives. Even successful fighters remained trapped inside systems of ownership and patronage. Freedom, when achieved, was conditional and fragile. A retired gladiator without wealthy connections could fall rapidly into poverty. Injuries prevented labor. Savings vanished, illness arrived. Rome had little social safety net beyond family and patronage, and gladiators often possessed weak family ties after years of displacement. Some likely ended their days anonymously. Not champions, not legends, just aging men with damaged bodies sitting quietly in crowded neighborhoods while younger generations filled the arenas instead. There's something melancholy about that transition. A fighter once cheered by thousands eventually becoming invisible, though perhaps invisibility also brought relief. No crowd demands, no performance, no fear before dawn on fight days. Just ordinary life, messy, loud, imperfect, ordinary life, a luxury many never reached. And perhaps the strangest thing about gladiators is how emotionally complicated Roman attitudes toward them became. Romans condemned them morally while admiring them aesthetically, feared them socially while celebrating them publicly, mocked them intellectually while obsessing over them culturally. The arena reflected Rome back at itself, its violence, its discipline, its vanity, its appetite for spectacle, its strange ability to normalize almost anything if enough marble columns surrounded it. And old gladiators carried all of that inside them long after retirement, living reminders of what Rome truly valued beneath all its philosophy and law. Strength, endurance, control, performance, survival, even survival scarred beyond recognition. So next time, we'll wander further into the wonderfully peculiar daily routines of arena life itself. The food, the gambling, the bizarre animal spectacles. The emperors who became alarmingly obsessed with gladiators personally, and the deeply unfortunate moment when Emperor Commodus decided he himself should enter the arena repeatedly, because apparently absolute political power did not provide enough opportunities for public attention already. A decision that, unsurprisingly, made everything stranger.